The most powerful CEO in the Western Hemisphere is gone, but you will not see his obituary in the Wall Street Journal. You will not see his company's stock plummet on the Nasdaq. Instead, you will see the wholesale price of a fentanyl pill spike in Ohio. You will see a sudden wave of violence in the avocado farms of Michoacan, and you will see global shipping lanes quietly reroute in the dead of night. Imagine you built the most profitable startup in the history of organized crime. You don't deal in street corners, you deal in continents. You control more supply chain infrastructure than most Fortune 500 companies. You have synthetic laboratories that print money regardless of weather or harvest. You have a private army with armoured vehicles and tactical drones. You have ports, you have politicians, you have avocados, and then your entire $50 billion operation depends on one man staying alive. Not just alive, in command. Feared. Present. Because the moment he isn't, every lieutenant who built this machine with their hands starts looking at the throne. How do you build the most powerful criminal enterprise in the Western Hemisphere and forget to write a succession plan? How do you run a business where the org chart ends at the top? How do you corner a global synthetic drug market and leave the kill switch inside one man's chest? Today, we're not just covering a death. We're performing a forensic audit on a $50 billion power vacuum. This is not a eulogy. This is a boardroom collapse. This is what happens when the world's most dangerous CEO forgot that even cartels need corporate governance, and the market has already started correcting his mistake. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes did not start at the top. He started in the dirt, literally. Born in 1966 in the impoverished rural municipality of Aguililla, Michoacan, a state already deep in the blood and soil of drug production, he grew avocados before he ever moved weight. He dropped out of primary school. He migrated illegally to California. By 1989, he had a San Francisco Police Department mugshot. By 1994, he had a federal conviction for conspiracy to distribute heroin and a 3-year sentence in a US prison. This is the resume of the man who would eventually build the most powerful criminal organization in the Western Hemisphere. Not a dynasty, not a cartel, a corporation. After his release and deportation back to Mexico, El Mencho went to work for the firms that already existed. He served as an enforcer and hitman for the Mencho Cartel, the dominant criminal franchise in Jalisco and Colima at the time. He understood the business from the ground up, the logistics, the violence, the internal politics, the revenue architecture. He was not just muscle, he was a student of organizational structure. And when his employers began to collapse, he recognized something that most of his peers did not. A market disruption is not a threat, it is a window. In 2009, the Mencho Cartel's CEO, Oscar Nava Valencia, known as El Lobo, was captured. The company fractured into competing factions. One half went in one direction. The other, led by El Mencho and co-founded alongside Eric Valencia Salazar, became what the world would eventually come to know as the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the CJNG. The name itself was a mission statement. New generation, not a successor, a disruptor. The startup phase was financed in blood. The early CJNG understood that market entry requires eliminating incumbents. Their first strategic campaign was not against rival traffickers, but against the Zetas, the most feared paramilitary organization in Mexico at the time. The Zetas had dominated through savagery, and the CJNG countered with a philosophy that essentially asked, what if we are more savage but also more organized? The cartel branded itself as Los Matazetas, the Zeta Killers, and released propaganda videos aimed at positioning them as a kind of corrective force in the criminal ecosystem, cleaning out the chaos so that business could resume. It was crude public relations, but it worked. Communities exhausted by Zeta extortion initially welcomed the new entrant. The CJNG expanded across Jalisco, Colima, and Nayarit within 18 months. The founding insight of the CJNG was not violence. Violence was table stakes. The founding insight was that the legacy cartels, including the Sinaloa cartel under El Chapo, had grown fat and slow. They had inherited territory rather than conquered it. El Mencho had no inheritance. He had a blueprint, a grudge, and an absolute willingness to outwork every competitor in the room. The company was born. The market would never be the same. The original cartel business model had a fatal dependency built into every balance sheet: weather. Heroin requires poppies, cocaine requires coca leaves. Both require land, climate, harvest cycles, and agricultural labour forces that could be disrupted by drought, eradication programs, or crop disease. You were, in the most fundamental sense, a farmer with guns. And farmers are at the mercy of nature in ways that a chemical laboratory is not. El Mencho understood this structural vulnerability early. The CJNG's pivot towards synthetic narcotics, primarily methamphetamine and eventually fentanyl, was not an accident of geography. It was a deliberate corporate strategy to move up the value chain, to replace an agricultural supply chain with a manufacturing supply chain. The implications were enormous. By 2018, US and Mexican authorities estimated that the CJNG was operating over 100 methamphetamine laboratories throughout Mexico. These were not improvised operations. They were industrial facilities, capable of producing metric tons of product that required no harvest season, no acreage, and no dependence on the weather patterns of a particular valley in Sinaloa or Guerrero. The raw inputs were chemicals, many of them sourced from Asia. The output was a product with higher margins, lower weight, and easier transportation characteristics than anything grown from the ground. Fentanyl was the inflection point. A single kilogram of fentanyl synthesized from chemical precursors can produce 500,000 lethal dose equivalents when cut for street distribution. A kilogram of heroin cannot come close. The profit per kilogram calculation is not even a comparison. It is a different industry entirely. When El Mencho's son, and the cartel's second in command, was sentenced in March 2025 to life in prison plus 30 additional years, the US government's forfeiture order attached to his conviction was $6 billion in drug trafficking proceeds. That figure represents, in part, the revenue generated by laboratory operations he directly supervised. Operations that manufactured over 1,000 metric tons of methamphetamine and routed fentanyl through supply lines that bypassed everything seasonal or geographic. The genius and the horror of the synthetic pivot was its scalability. A poppy harvest can be interrupted. A chemical laboratory can be relocated to a new warehouse overnight. It requires no soil. It does not care about rainfall. It does not wait for any season. The CJNG had effectively industrialized addiction, and the demand curve for their product was, from a purely analytical standpoint, one of the most stable in the history of global commerce. The United States drug market was not going anywhere. The only question was who would supply it most efficiently. El Mencho's answer was to remove every biological variable from the equation. He moved the cartel off the farm and into the factory. The margins that followed were extraordinary. The death toll that followed was historic. The CJNG did not expand. It acquired. The distinction matters because expansion implies organic growth, a slow territorial creep through negotiation and attrition. What the CJNG did was something closer to a hostile corporate takeover, complete with a shock-and-awe deployment of force designed to make the cost of resistance exceed any conceivable benefit. The instrument of acquisition was a paramilitary force that operated with a discipline and tactical capability unprecedented in Mexican criminal history. Former soldiers, former federal police, foreign mercenaries, and locally recruited sicarios were trained in coordinated assault tactics, communication security, and the use of military-grade weaponry. This was not a street gang with better guns. This was an armed corporate security apparatus with an offensive mandate. The strategic logic was straightforward. The CJNG identified target territories, key highway corridors, port cities, distribution hubs, and agricultural zones. It then deployed its paramilitary units to eliminate or subordinate every local criminal organization operating in those zones. Rivals who resisted were massacred. Rivals who submitted were absorbed into a franchise model, operating under the CJNG banner in exchange for a percentage of revenue and access to the cartel's superior supply chain. The cartel used affiliation agreements with smaller local groups to extend its footprint across at least 27 of Mexico's 32 states, without needing to directly staff every operation. It was a franchise model that any business school professor would recognize, implemented through violence that no business school professor would ever teach. The 2015 downing of a Mexican military helicopter in Jalisco became the clearest public demonstration of what the CJNG's paramilitary capability had become. Using a rocket-propelled grenade, cartel forces shot the aircraft out of the sky, killing 9 law enforcement officials. The message to the Mexican government was not subtle. The CJNG was not hiding from state power. It was contesting it directly. It had the weapons, the personnel, and the institutional will to treat the Mexican military as just another rival organization whose market control needed to be challenged. By the time the US State Department designated CJNG as a foreign terrorist organization in February 2025, the cartel had operations in over 40 countries across the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Europe. The hostile takeover of the Mexican criminal landscape had not just been completed, it had been internationalized. Jalisco's most dangerous startup had gone global, and it had done so not through diplomacy or business development, but through the systematic application of organized violence as a competitive strategy. Somewhere between the fentanyl laboratories and the armed helicopters, the CJNG's finance team made a discovery that every serious criminal enterprise eventually makes. Legitimate industries are easier to tax than they are to compete with. You do not need to run an avocado farm. You simply need to make it more expensive for everyone else not to pay you. Michoacán produces more avocados than any other state on Earth. Its annual export value to the United States alone has hovered around $2.4 to $2.8 billion, numbers that earned the fruit the nickname green gold long before the cartels noticed. The state supplies roughly 80% of all US avocado imports, meaning that every guacamole, every avocado toast, every Super Bowl snack plate in American history has almost certainly passed through territory the CJNG has treated as a revenue stream. The mechanics of agricultural extortion are not complicated. Cartel affiliates approach farmers and calculate a monthly protection fee based on either the number of hectares under cultivation or the kilograms produced and exported. Payment ensures that your trucks are not hijacked, your workers are not kidnapped, and your children are not threatened. Non-payment ensures the opposite. The fee is not optional. It is a tax, enforced by people with automatic weapons and an operational history that leaves no room for skepticism about whether the consequences are real. The CJNG extended the same model to limes. Mexico is the second largest lime exporter in the world, with roughly 900,000 tons produced annually, approximately 90% of which is destined for the United States. In the Apatzingan Valley in Michoacán, the cartel created a dedicated enforcement group specifically for lime extortion operations, reporting ultimately to the CJNG chain of command. When lime farmers in Michoacán went on strike in August 2024 to protest escalating extortion demands, cartel pressure was so intense that authorities deployed National Guard units to the region. Farmers were being charged per kilo at multiple stages of the supply chain. Producers who refused were killed. The genius of this revenue diversification was its legal camouflage. Drug trafficking generates products that can be seized, operations that can be disrupted, and supply chains that law enforcement can map and interdict. Extortion of avocado and lime farmers generates cash from businesses that file taxes, employ tens of thousands of workers, and appear in legitimate export records. The money moves through legal commerce before it ever needs to be laundered. The CJNG was not just in the drug business, it was in the food business, and every mango, avocado, and lime crossing the border at Laredo carried invisibly a fraction of the cartel's operating budget inside it. The product does not move without the pipeline, and the pipeline for the CJNG was built on 2 critical foundations: chemical precursors sourced primarily from Asia, and absolute dominance over Mexico's Pacific coastline ports. Strip either of those away, and the entire synthetic manufacturing operation, the laboratories, the fentanyl, the methamphetamine, the billions in annual revenue, starts to degrade. Mencho understood this, and he invested in infrastructure with the discipline of someone who had watched predecessor organizations collapse precisely because they neglected logistics. The chemical precursors required to synthesize fentanyl and methamphetamine at industrial scale are not produced in Mexico. They come primarily from China and, to a lesser extent, India, often shipped as ostensibly legal industrial chemicals, relabeled, rerouted through third-country intermediaries, and delivered to Mexican ports where corrupt customs officials and dock workers ensure they clear inspection. The CJNG built relationships with Chinese chemical suppliers, international shipping brokers, and logistics networks that spanned multiple continents. By the time a precursor chemical arrived at a CJNG laboratory in Jalisco, it had passed through enough legal-looking paperwork to be nearly untraceable. The port of Manzanillo in Colima became a primary node in this supply chain. CJNG territorial control over Colima was not incidental, it was strategic. Manzanillo is one of Mexico's highest volume container ports, processing millions of shipping containers per year, and it sits within the cartel's core operational territory. Corrupting the port was not a side operation, it was an infrastructure investment. Similarly, Lázaro Cárdenas in Michoacán, the second major Pacific port, became a contested prize that multiple cartels fought for, precisely because of its role in the chemical import pipeline. The DEA estimated in 2019 that the CJNG was responsible for at least 1/3 of all drugs entering the United States by air and sea. That figure reflects not just the scale of production, but the sophistication of the logistics architecture behind it. The cartel was not just making drugs, it was running a multinational import-export operation with chemical procurement, manufacturing, transportation, distribution, and retail divisions operating across dozens of countries simultaneously. Fortune 500 companies employ entire departments to manage supply chains of comparable complexity. The CJNG managed theirs under the constant threat of law enforcement interdiction, rival interference, and the inherent chaos of operating outside every legal protection that legitimate businesses take for granted. That it worked as consistently as it did was, in purely operational terms, a remarkable management achievement. A business empire worth $50 billion requires a security budget to match. The CJNG did not hire bodyguards, it built an army. The cartel's private military force evolved over its first decade from a collection of street-level enforcers into a paramilitary organization with specialized units, tactical training programs, standardized weapons procurement, and equipment that rivaled the material of the Mexican federal government. It was regularly fighting. Armoured vehicles, fabricated in clandestine workshops from civilian trucks, were reinforced with steel plating and mounted with heavy machine guns. The cartel produced propaganda videos showing columns of these vehicles moving in coordinated formation through rural Mexico, an explicit message to rivals and governments alike. We have the hardware to contest any engagement. Weaponized drones entered the corporate security toolkit as early technology access became cheaper, and operational ingenuity filled the gaps that off-the-shelf military equipment could not. CJNG units used commercially available drones modified to carry and drop explosive charges, targeting rival camps, military checkpoints, and law enforcement positions. By the late 2000s, the Mexican military was encountering drone attacks in cartel conflict zones, with enough regularity that it fundamentally changed the tactical calculus of counter-narcotics operations. The cartel was not just keeping pace with government capabilities. In some theaters, it was ahead of them. The 2020 assassination attempt against Omar Garcia Harfuch, then chief of Mexico City's police force, illustrated the cartel's willingness to deploy this security apparatus in urban environments against senior government officials. Gunmen attacked his convoy in the middle of one of the world's largest cities with grenades and high-powered rifles, wounding him and killing 2 of his bodyguards. It was not a covert operation, it was a demonstration. Recruitment fueled this machine through a combination of financial incentives, social coercion, and brute force. Fake job advertisements lured economically desperate applicants into recruitment pipelines where they were given a choice: join or face consequences. Training was rigorous and brutal. The cartel's Hitman program operated with the discipline of a military basic training structure, producing soldiers who understood chain of command, tactical communication, and the rules of engagement that the CJNG enforced internally. The result was an organization that the US State Department, when it designated CJNG as a foreign terrorist organization in February 2025, described as possessing the highest trafficking capacity of any criminal organization in Mexico, while simultaneously operating what amounted to a standing army inside a sovereign nation. Corporate security, in the CJNG model, was not a support function. It was the product's most important feature. Without it, no laboratory, no port, no avocado tax, and no global supply chain holds together for more than a season. The rumours of El Mencho's death began years before his actual death. In February 2022, Mexican press reports circulated claiming he had been killed in a confrontation with rivals. Messages scrawled on walls around Guadalajara announced that he had died of kidney failure in a hospital. A splinter faction of CJNG in Colima, the Mezcals, formally declared their secession from the cartel that same year, citing El Mencho's alleged death as their justification for terminating allegiance. He was not dead. But the rumours were telling. They were the market's way of stress testing a question that everyone already understood. What happens to the corporation when the founder goes? The biological reality was that Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was failing. Kidney disease, reported by multiple intelligence sources over the years, had degraded his physical capacity to manage operations directly. The man who had built an empire on personal authority and fear-based leadership was increasingly absent from the day-to-day decisions that held the cartel's competing factions in alignment. Intelligence agencies noted operational changes consistent with diminished central command. Regional lieutenants who would historically have deferred upward began making autonomous decisions. The tension between centralized discipline and distributed chaos, always latent in any criminal organization, began to surface. The arrest that closed in around El Mencho's inner circle accelerated the destabilization. His brother Antonio, El Tony Montana, was captured in Guadalajara in December 2022. His brother Abraham, Don Rodo, the cartel's money laundering architect, was arrested in February 2025 and extradited to the United States. His son, El Menchito, CJNG's second-in-command, who had run the cartel's operations for nearly 7 years, was sentenced in March 2025 to life in prison plus 30 consecutive years. His son-in-law, El Gaucho, was arrested in Riverside, California in November 2024 and pleaded guilty to international money laundering conspiracy in June 2025. His wife received a prison sentence. The family infrastructure of the CJNG, the inner circle that El Mencho trusted above any corporate hierarchy, was being systematically dismantled while he was still alive. On February 22, 2026, the Mexican army found him in Tapalpa, a quiet highland town approximately 130 kilometers from Guadalajara. He was wounded in the operation, loaded onto a transport and died before reaching Mexico City. The reward bounties, $15 million from Washington and 300 million pesos from Mexico City, expired uncollected. The CEO was gone. Not through a rival's bullet in a cartel war, through a military operation quietly in a town most people have never heard of. The architecture of fear he built responded instantly. Within hours of his death, CJNG members across the country erected roadblocks, torched vehicles and businesses, and sent residents into hiding. The Mexican government reported 25 members of the National Guard killed in Jalisco alone in 6 separate attacks that followed. Airlines suspended operations at Guadalajara and Puerto Vallarta. The violence was not grief. It was a proxy war for position. The throne was already being contested before his body reached the morgue. The succession problem was baked into the founding documents of the CJNG, even if no one wrote it down. El Mencho built an organization around personal authority. He was not a CEO who developed middle management. He was the center of gravity, and every key decision passed through him or through family members he trusted absolutely. That architecture, which had been a strength when he was operational, became a structural vulnerability the moment he stopped being operational. His son, El Menchito, the designated heir, was serving life plus 30 years in a US federal prison. His brother Don Rodo, the financial backbone, was in Mexican custody awaiting extradition proceedings. His son-in-law, El Gaucho, was in US custody awaiting sentencing. His stepson, Juan Carlos Valencia Gonzalez, known as El Pelon, was acknowledged by US intelligence as the de facto second-in-command. but security analysts noted candidly that El Pelon lacked influence among cartel commanders. Being second in command to El Mencho did not automatically translate to command authority in a post-El Mencho organization. The title meant nothing without the loyalty, and the loyalty had never been tested. Into this vacuum stepped 4 or 5 senior commanders who understood simultaneously that the throne was open and that claiming it publicly would make them a target for every rival who also wanted it. Analysts named Ricardo Ruiz Velasco, known as El Doble R, as one likely candidate. Odious Flores Silva, El Jardinero, the cartel's agricultural extortion specialist, and a senior DEA designated trafficker was another. Hugo Mendoza Gaitan, El Sapo, appeared on the same shortlist. Each controlled territory, soldiers, and revenue streams. None controlled the others. The Sinaloa cartel, the CJNG's primary rival for decades, was itself fractured by internal war between the faction loyal to El Chapo's sons and the faction loyal to El Mayo Zambada, who surrendered to US authorities in 2024 and was cooperating with prosecutors. Two of the most powerful criminal organizations in North America were simultaneously in succession crises. The Mexican underworld, by February 2026, was not a hierarchical criminal landscape. It was a boardroom brawl with military-grade weapons. Every analyst who studies cartel dynamics knows the pattern. The period immediately following the removal of a dominant leader is the most violent, not because the organization is dying, but because it is fighting over who gets to run it. The assets are real. The ports, the laboratories, the distribution networks, the franchise affiliates across 27 states, the global supply chain touching 40 countries. None of those assets disappeared when El Mencho died. They became prizes, and prizes attract contestants willing to do anything to claim them. Here is what the death of El Mencho does not do. It does not eliminate demand, it does not close the laboratories, it does not seal the ports, it does not end the relationship between Chinese chemical suppliers and Mexican synthetic drug producers. It does not make American consumers stop buying the product that the CJNG supply chain delivers. The $50 billion market does not mourn its CEO. It looks for a new one. The CJNG's franchise model was designed, intentionally or not, to be resilient against exactly this kind of leadership disruption. Regional affiliates operate with enough autonomy that the loss of central command degrades efficiency without halting operations entirely. Supply chains built over 15 years do not evaporate overnight. The chemical procurement networks, the port relationships, the distribution corridors into the US market. These persist because they are embedded in human relationships, financial dependencies, and institutional knowledge held by hundreds of mid-level operators who are still alive, still operational, and still motivated by the same profit incentives that built the organization in the first place. The most likely outcomes, according to security analysts tracking the aftermath of El Mencho's death, do not include the disappearance of the CJNG. They include a period of intense, concentrated violence as competing factions resolve the succession question through the only dispute resolution mechanism available to them. They include a possible fragmentation into regional sub-organizations that maintain the CJNG brand and supply chain relationships while operating with greater autonomy. They include the eventual emergence of either a new dominant leader with enough force of personality and military backing to consolidate control, or a fractured oligopoly of regional bosses who carve up the territory and learn to coexist at arm's length. What they do not include is the market going away. The demand for fentanyl, methamphetamine, and cocaine in the United States is not a cultural preference that ends when a particular trafficker dies. It is a public health infrastructure problem decades in the making, generating billions in revenue for whoever is capable of meeting it. The black market has survived the arrests of El Chapo and El Mayo. It survived the collapse of the Medellin and Cali cartels. It survived every major law enforcement operation that has ever been called a turning point. It survived because demand does not have a face, does not need a CEO, and cannot be extradited. El Mencho built something extraordinary. He also built something that was always going to outlive him. The corporation he created is now in its most dangerous phase, leaderless, well-resourced, contested, and fully operational. The black market does not close for a funeral. It adjusts, it restructures, it promotes from within, and the product, as always, keeps moving. The story of El Mencho is not over. It has not even finished its first chapter without him. If this breakdown changed the way you think about organised crime, global supply chains, or the economics of the black market, share it with someone who needs to understand what is actually happening south of the border and why it matters north of it. Subscribe if you want the next forensic audit, because the next CEO of the most powerful criminal organisation in the Western Hemisphere is already making moves, and when they consolidate power, we will be here to run the numbers. The market never sleeps. Neither do we.